So today is Palm Sunday, which marks the start of what is known in the church as Holy Week, when we remember Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He rode a donkey while people spread palm branches and cloaks on the road before him, sort of like a rural red carpet. It was this day of great celebration and adoration for the King of Kings. However, as I'm sure you know, the adoration was short-lived, because in less than a week's time, those cries turned from Hosanna to the Son of David to crucify him. Crucify him. We have no king but Caesar. And although the world of celebrity is a fickle one, there is more going on here than just the wavering whims of the crowd, because Jesus knew. He knew before he entered the city that day there was only one way that this was going to end. He intentionally chose to present himself in such a way that the authorities were forced to act. They either needed to crown him as king or silence him for good. So why did Jesus do it? Why did he back them into this corner, knowing they would have no choice but to set in motion the events that would ultimately lead to his crucifixion? Would it not have been better for him to just maintain the status quo? Keep traveling and preaching and healing the sick, at least for a few more years? Why did matters need to come to a head? After all, Jesus had only been ministering for 3 years at this point. What is Palm Sunday really all about? Well, let's open the scriptures together and see what we can find out. If you have a Bible in front of you, please turn to Matthew chapter 21. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. Not sure how that worked exactly. Did Jesus sit on the donkey and put his feet on the colt, or just swap between the two of them? I don't know. But anyway, a very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in highest heaven." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. "It is written," he said to them, "my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children shouting in the temple courts, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. "Do you hear what these children are saying?" they asked him. "Yes," replied Jesus. "Have you never read, 'From the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth your praise'?" And he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, where he spent the night. So let me just paint this picture for you. The story begins with Jesus approaching Bethphage, which is located on the Mount of Olives, sort of halfway between Bethany and Jerusalem on the temple side. So if you started in Bethany and you were heading to the city, you would go through Bethphage and the Garden of Gethsemane and then enter the city at the temple gates. And that's precisely what Jesus did. Bethany and its surrounding villages were very well known to Jesus. It was the home of some of his closest friends, Mary and Martha, and their brother Lazarus, who Jesus had not long raised back to life. It was a safe place for him. Although Jesus had previously said the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, this was maybe the closest thing he had to a home, owing to the amount of time that he spent there and the miracles that he performed. Jesus would have been very well known. Locals would have welcomed him with open arms, invited him into their homes and offered him whatever assistance they could. And indeed, Jesus utilizes their hospitality to procure himself a mode of transport with which to enter the city gates, this donkey and her colt. It's not clear from the text whether he had some miraculous foresight of the donkey's location or just knew a guy who happened to rent them out, like a Euro donkey deal. But why a donkey in the first place? Surely there are better modes of transportation, even in Jesus' day, a horse or a chariot or some sort of first century Uber. I don't know. Well, the answer is that Jesus wanted to weave a very particular narrative as he passed through the villages on the way to the city. You see, we have to remember that Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, not a Christian, or even white or blonde. That's just kind of Western art. No, Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jewish man, and the Jewish nation, particularly those who studied the scriptures, had certain expectations of God. They were waiting for him to send a Messiah, someone who would come and rescue them, save them. So, for example, in the first scroll of the Torah, the book of Genesis, it says this: "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nation shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes." It's very poetic language, but it essentially means that a descendant from the line of Judah would come and rule the nations. And this idea of being washed in wine speaks of divine favour, of prosperity and wealth and affluence. So much so that you can tie your donkey to the vine and not really worry about how many of the grapes they eat. And then, of course, we have this verse referenced by Matthew himself in Zechariah 9, which says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem. The battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth." Someone is coming on a donkey to rescue and rule the nation, to bring wealth and prosperity with them. So just imagine for a minute that you're a first century Jewish person living in those villages surrounding the temple. You'd have heard these sorts of scriptures read many, many times before. You would be familiar with the prophecies. You're waiting patiently for the Messiah to come, the one who will rescue your people, who will free you from oppression and usher in this new age of prosperity and peace. And then you hear that Jesus is arriving on a donkey. Jesus who brought Lazarus back from the dead, Jesus who heals the sick and teaches with authority, is coming on a donkey. Now you're thinking, could this be him? Could this be the Messiah? What do you do? Do you carry on folding your laundry, or do you go and take a look? And then you hear the crowd and see the people walking beside him, waving those palm branches and shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David." And Hosanna, by the way, means deliver us, save us, rescue us. The sort of thing you might shout at a Messiah. And there are songs, and there's dancing and celebration. And Jesus seems to be heading straight for the big city. Suddenly, you're no longer concerned whether or not you've left the iron on back home. You're looking for your own branch, and you're beginning to sing along, Hosanna in highest heaven. And Jesus just smiles, seems to accept all the praise and the titles being bestowed upon him, and continues on his way towards Jerusalem. The crowd increasing with every step. Have you ever seen Disney's Aladdin? You know that scene where the genie turns Aladdin into a prince, and then they go and march into Agrabah with that massive entourage singing Prince Ali, fabulous he, Ali Ababwa. Well, that's exactly what's happening here. Jesus is making an entrance. Sometimes when this story is told, we kind of imagine Jesus arriving with his disciples and the city being the ones that welcomed him, but that's not what happened. Jesus marched into the city with his own crowd. That's why it says in verse 10 that when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred, and they asked, "Who is this?" And his entourage answered, "Jesus, he from Nazareth in Galilee." Jesus wanted the whole city to know he'd arrived. And what's more, he wanted people to recognize that some had started to worship him as the Messiah. Up until this point, he'd been a bit more coy. He'd only referred to himself as the Son of Man. When he healed people, he told them not to say anything. And when he revealed things to his disciples, he told them to keep it to themselves. So what's changed? Why the sudden fanfare? Well, to answer that, we need to look at the first thing that Jesus does when he arrives in the city. I mean, I'm sure the crowds were wondering, right? What's he going to do? Will he hold a meeting and give a rousing speech? Will he call people to arms? Maybe he'll perform a miracle and they won't even need to fight. The Roman soldiers will just march out of the city. And Jesus doesn't do any of that. He does something truly unexpected. He enters the temple courts and he starts kicking over tables and chasing off moneylenders, shouting, "My house," notice that, "my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." What? Why is Jesus attacking the temple? I mean, I'm sure some people enjoyed the spectacle, but this seems a bit off for the Messiah, right? Surely it should be King Herod's court or Caesar's palace where the tables need kicking over, not the temple. And understandably, the chief priests and the teachers of the law come out to see what all the commotion, what all the fuss is about. And they hear the singing and the shouts of Hosanna to the Son of David, and they see the chaos and the disgruntled moneylenders. And they say, "Oi, Jesus, do you hear what they're saying? Do you know what they're calling you? These kids, they're calling you the Son of David, the Messiah, the Saviour. You might want to do something about that, mate. Tell them it's not true. Remind them of who it is who's really in charge." And Jesus looks at them and says, "Yeah, I can hear them." And you know what? It says in Psalms, "From the lips of children you, Lord, have called forth your praise." And then he drops the microphone, grabs his donkeys and leaves. Goes back to Bethany, presumably dropping the donkeys back on the way. What a start to the week. Such drama, such chaos, and it doesn't really calm down the next day either. He comes back and Jesus is even more confrontational this time. He tells the crowds not to copy the chief priests or the teachers of the law because they don't practice what they preach. He calls them hypocrites and blind guides and whitewashed tombs and snakes and vipers. And then he warns his disciples not to put their faith in the temple because he says it's all going to come down. And as the week wore on, people came to realize that this Messiah, this Saviour, was not the one they were expecting. Rather than overthrowing the ruling powers, Jesus seemed more interested in dealing with the systems of oppression that they themselves had become party to. He was confronting all of the wrong people. He wasn't doing any of the things that people expected him to do for them. This was Jesus at his most confrontational. Because not only was he confronting the religious leaders of his day, but he was confronting the image of himself that his followers had created in their mind. Personally, I'm not a big fan of confrontation. It's not something that I seek out or go looking for. I know some people do, but that's not me. I have, however, had my fair share, because it's kind of what happens when you have children. You get drawn into conflict. But sometimes conflict is necessary, because without certain confrontation, nothing changes. For example, if I allowed my children to sleep in during the week, they would never make it to school on time, or maybe even ever. And so it's worth all the banging on the bedroom door and the turning on the lights and asking Alexa to play the opening to The Lion King really loud. Similarly, if I allow them to do nothing in the house, they would become entitled and never learn the skills they need to hopefully eventually leave. So it's worth all the nagging and the moaning and the eye rolls and the grunts of disapproval. I mean, at least I hope it is. But Jesus also knew that this moment of confrontation was necessary, because without it, nothing would change. You know, for the past 10 weeks, we've been exploring Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus sets out the values of his kingdom. He calls people to flee from anger and lust and greed, to pursue grace and love and forgiveness, to become people of integrity, in order that we might be a light to the world. But here's the thing. When we pursue those values with all that we have, they will eventually lead us into conflict. They must, because they don't line up with the systems of oppression that exist in our world. We cannot pursue grace and love and refuse to make room for everyone at the table, as the moneylenders in the courts were doing. We cannot pursue forgiveness and mercy and stand in judgment over people, as the chief priests and the teachers of the law were doing. We cannot be people of integrity, salt and light, without speaking up for the oppressed, the marginalised, those without a voice. Eventually, we have to say enough is enough, even if there is a cost to ourselves. As the famous quote goes, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph in the world is that good people do nothing. Or, as Jesus said, no one lights a lamp and puts it under a bowl. You see, in choosing to arrive on a donkey and accept the praises of the crowds, Jesus was shining his light for all to see. He was saying to the city, either you accept me as king, in which case things are going to change around here, or you do your best to silence me. Of course, Jesus knew that his kingdom couldn't be silenced, not even by his death, and indeed that his forgiveness of those who placed him on the cross, his outpouring of love for a world that rejected him, was actually the very way that he would establish his kingdom forever and ever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm trying to do what I always do and rush ahead to Resurrection Sunday. Perhaps it's enough for us in this moment to wrestle with the same question that Jesus placed before the city that day. Are we going to crown him as king, recognizing that some things might need to change? Or are we going to be those who try and silence his voice in our life? I suppose, on the one hand, it's easy for us to pick up palm branches and sing along. It's kind of what we do every Sunday, right? We come to church and we join in, sometimes maybe without even really thinking about it. But what about when the celebration is over? What about when things get tough? When the life that Jesus has called us to begins to rub against other people's expectations of us? What about when it leads us into confrontation? What then? Do we back down? Or do we continue to shine a light for all to see? What about when Jesus doesn't meet our expectations? When instead of doing the things that we want him to do, like dealing with our enemies or bringing us wealth and prosperity, he does something else, something unexpected, maybe even something that makes us a little uncomfortable, like challenging our preconceived ideas or causing us to consider what systems of oppression we may have bought into, either knowingly or unknowingly. What about when he suggests that the temples and idols in our lives need to come down? What about when he asks us to forgive that person we've come to hate? What about when he calls us to stand up for those who are being hurt by those in power? What about when Jesus doesn't answer our prayers in the way that we want him to? When he calls us to trust him beyond this life? What do we do when Jesus doesn't meet our expectations? Do we return to our village, scratching our heads and wondering how we so easily got sucked into all the drama? Or do we dig in? Do we choose to trust him, knowing that all the conflicts and heartache and trouble of this life is ultimately leading us somewhere good? That last week of Jesus' life on earth must have been so difficult, especially as Jesus knew it would end in his crucifixion. But Jesus also knew that his death wasn't the end of the story, either for him or us. That in fact, it was a necessary thing in order to bring us new life. I'm sure many of you listening today have had your fair share of difficulties. Times when your faith has actually made your life harder, not easier. I'm sure there are also those that have felt disappointed by God because he hasn't acted or done what you expected him to do. But the promise of Jesus, and indeed the message of Easter, is that despite all of the pain and hardship, all of the rejection and the suffering, this is ultimately heading somewhere good. So much so that the Apostle Paul was able to write, "I consider our present sufferings not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us." And so how are you going to respond on this Palm Sunday? Are you going to crown Jesus as King? Maybe even for the first time. Not just because of the crowd, but because you believe that he's going to lead you somewhere good. Or are you going to continue to ignore him and just kind of hope things work out on their own? Jesus wants you to enter into the new life that he has for you now. But the choice is always yours.